All right. Well, you know what? It is 5 o'clock on the West Coast here, so we're going to get this meeting started for this edition of the Vancouver Power BI and Modern Excel User Group Meetup. And tonight is a hybrid. We've got both technologies that are going to be in play. We're going to be starting with Joseph giving us the what's new in Power BI, and then I'm actually going to switch it over and take a look at doing some Power Query work. And I'm generally tend to know, or most of you who know me tend to know, that I generally tend to lean to doing this stuff in Excel. It's not like this is impossible to do in Power BI, but it would involve some additional layers with things that honestly I think it just overcomplicates things. So I do want to say a big thanks to the sponsors that make this evening possible. Skillwave is, as many of you know, my training company where we actually teach people how to do the stuff that I'm going to show you today. Excelguru is the parent company of Skillwave and also happens to be responsible for the production and distribution of an add-in called Monkey Tools for Excel, which you are going to also see a little bit of today as well. Our next meetups that we have coming up on June 8th at 5 p.m. Pacific time, we're welcoming my friend Kurt Fry, who's going to be talking about simulating processes in Excel with minimal pain. I'm really looking forward to seeing what Kurt actually has for us here. So should be a good time to see what he's bringing to us. Following that, our next Power BI track, we're actually going to start looking back at Power BI again. Matt Allington is going to be joining me, as many of you know, my partner from Skillwave, and he is going to be leading a topic on sum versus sum X, and what the differences are between these things. So that should be a really interesting. Didn't know Excel and minimal pain could be used in the same sentence. Ouch, Melinda, that's terrible. But yes, absolutely. So let's move forward here. Just a quick note. In a month, approximately, I have a new semester kicking off of my Excel Fundamentals Bootcamp. If you feel that your Excel base knowledge could be better with formulas and pivot tables and Power Query, or if you've got people on your team where you feel that that is the case, you should definitely check out our Excel Fundamentals Bootcamp. This has got lots of training in there. There's coaching sessions. You get access to up to 23 yeah, that's right. 23 2-hour Ask Me Anything sessions throughout the life of the product, plus a great curriculum material here to really help you sort of round out your Excel game and get you introduced to the layers that are required to move on to our next product, which is actually the Self-Service BI Bootcamp, where we actually start marrying Excel and Power Query and Power BI all together with Power Pivot to build robust self-service business intelligence solutions. This also has a huge amount of video material. It's got Ask Me Anything sessions that go on a regular basis. There's a huge amount of touch points in this. So if you're looking for coaching and learning products, this is a great product. And again, we have another semester of this one is kicking off on June 14th. Although if you sign up early, you can actually get access to all of the material right off the bat anyway. Every one of our meetups is recorded and hosted at the Skillwave YouTube page. The link is here. I know that the slide deck has already been uploaded to the meetup channel where this meetup was posted. Just be aware that it takes me about 24 to 48 hours to get the meetup produced and uploaded there. So it will come, just a little patience along the way there. And then you can go back and you can watch all of the previous episodes that we've actually had on our YouTube channel. So if you like bite-sized tips on different things, you should check out my Monkey Shorts videos at our Skillwave YouTube channel. We've got a bunch of these that are less than 3 minutes of technical content every time. So we're doing a little bit of a review of some of the ones that we have, some Power Query filtering tips and emojis. You'll actually see that tonight. And we won't be talking about using Excel while the Power Query editor is open today, but definitely the emoji things are going to come along the way here. The last thing that I'm going to say before I turn it over to Joseph to do our What's New in Power BI is if you are interested in speaking at VanPUG, we would love to have you. Just fill out the survey here at excelguru.ca/speakatvanpug. We'll get in touch with you and get you on our stage. We love having new people come and show us the cool things that they can do with Excel or Power BI or anything in the Power Platform stack, really. It's a great thing to be able to see different opinions and different methods that people actually use. That's my bit for the intro. Joseph, I think it's your turn. Are you ready, my friend, for a little What's New?
Let's do it.
All right.
I will grab the power from you.
All right. I have stopped sharing. It is all yours.
Sounds good. All right, cool. Thanks, Ken. Welcome, everybody, to the May 2023 What's New in Power BI. I'm actually going to be going over the April 2023 feature summary for Power BI. The reason for that is as of 10 a.m. this morning, I haven't seen a May release, and Ken and I were chatting earlier, and I hypothesized that we may be waiting until next week when Microsoft Build is happening to get the May release. So what was nice is we didn't have a Power BI track session last month for the meetup group. So just means I guess I get to do May and June all in one next month, but I get to go back and cover April today. So for those of you who have come before, welcome back. For those of you who maybe this is your first time, my name is Joseph Yeates, and I often do the What's New in Power BI at the beginning of the Power BI sessions for our meetup group. I've done a few feature presentations before. I did one a few months ago in February. I don't remember. Maybe it was January. And a few over the last couple of years as well. I've been involved pretty much, I think, since the beginning of the meetup group. But I guess with that, why don't we just jump into some of my favorite features of what's new in Power BI for April. So as always, sort of my frame of reference here is the monthly feature summary blog post that goes up. And what I like about this is we see just a list with links down to the different sections of the blog for all of the either new preview features that were previously in preview and are now generally available, or just updates and brand new features right away for the Power BI desktop for this month. And they're usually split into these different sections of like reporting, analytics, modeling, and so on and so forth. So I think I'm going to cover 3, maybe 4 new features for the April feature release. And I'm pretty much going to be sticking around the top part of the new features here. But just before I jump into that, one thing that was announced in this last week or so, a pre-announcement, as we can see here, this was from last week, is better Power BI report integration with OneDrive and SharePoint. So I haven't had a chance to actually get in and see this myself, but really there are 2 main improvements coming here. The first is that we're actually going to be able to view Power BI files directly in SharePoint or our OneDrive for Business, and with the goal, I guess, or the idea of working seamlessly in Power BI desktop with files from our OneDrive or from SharePoint. I was reading over this blog post today. All of the screenshots in the blog looks good. There's a few steps that we're going to have to do if we are the Power BI admin for our organization, or we might have to ask the Power BI admin for our organization just to get this up and running. And as always, when it comes to some of these new features and announcements, I would recommend scrolling all the way down to the bottom and looking at some of the comments here, because that's a bit of a sanity check, I find, for myself, that if other people are experiencing either bugs or limitations, or it has maybe even this update hasn't rolled out to everyone just yet, it's a great way to check there. So if you are using OneDrive for Business or SharePoint and you're using Power BI, I would check this out, because this looks like a cool update coming that hopefully makes working with Power BI even more seamless within our internal intranet and infrastructure. So the first update for this month, so back to sort of the Power BI update, are updates to on-object authoring and interaction. And so really the majority of this update are bug fixes. I previewed this on-object authoring feature, I guess not last month, but the month before, when it came out in preview. And so a big update from previously is the card visual is now supported as a visual type, which is nice. But most of the other updates from the blog post here, as we can see, are all bug fixes. But I guess I'm going to go back into Power BI now, and we'll take a look to see exactly what I mean by what on-object authoring is. So the typical or the previous experience in creating visuals in Power BI is we would have our data frame and our visualizations pane here over to the right hand side. and we would just click on it, and then we would drag fields into our visual, and our visual, we would create it. But with on-object authoring, that changes. We now, up here in the Home tab of the ribbon, in the this Insert section, we see a lot of the visual types that used to be in our Visualizations pane. So I can actually select which visual that I want to build, or I can hit New Visual, and this brings up just one big visual here. I'll just make that a little bit bigger so we can see it. And in the top right-hand corner, we now have the option to build a visual. We have a few visual types that look like what we see up here in the ribbon. And we also see a suggest a type option that right now is toggled on. And so directly from the visual, we can add data. So from our fact table, I can add total balance. And we can see that since we have just one single scalar numeric value, the recommended or the suggested visual type is a card, because this is what Power BI thinks is the most appropriate visual to visualize this type of data. But if I continue to add additional data, like if I have client type, so now we have a categorical field along with that numeric data, it is determined, oh, why don't we have a bar chart? This might be a good way to visualize this data. And if I add, let me add like count of clients, now I have two numeric columns, I have a categorical column, and it thinks scatter plot is the best way to do this. And so we can toggle this on and off, and we can see that with the selecting which visual to build, as well as formatting, some of these formatting options are directly or are available now directly within the visual. So we can add zoom sliders, category labels if we want to, trend lines, all of these things giving us an experience more aligned with Excel, I would say, in charting and creating some of those visuals in Excel. And if we do want more formatting options, we can hit more options here, and then we get sort of our format pane back up where we're familiar with it. One of the updates actually was a way that we can more easily collapse this formatting pane if we don't want it. We now have this drop-down pane options, and we can hit collapse, and that opens up that space again. So again, a few little bug fixes for this new experience in creating visuals within our Power BI report. And I'm sure there'll be a few updates along the way, because this really was a huge paradigm shift with using Power BI Desktop and creating visuals within this application. So let's go back to the blog here. And if I scroll back up to the top, the second feature that I wanted to look at are dynamic format strings for measures. So this is a really cool update, and what this allows us to do is instead of formatting a DAX measure as just one thing, as like a currency type or a binary or text, or just selecting one formatting for our DAX measure, if our DAX measure is able to give us different types of data returned, we have the ability to dynamically format that measure depending on the output it gives us. And we can define that with a different DAX measure. So this section of the blog is quite detailed. It explains a scenario where we might want to use this functionality. If I jump back into my Power BI report here, if I go to our total balance measure, so we see on the format here on the drop down, we have currency. Right now, this is a currency, as it's only returning. It will only ever return the value of a currency. But if this measure could return, say, count of clients that we just want as an integer, as opposed to a dollar value, I could select dynamic from the drop down here. And once I do that, now we see to the left of the formula bar here. Why don't I make this a little bit bigger? To the left of the formula bar, we have the option for the format for our measure, or just defining the measure itself. So this is the code that defines our measure, and this is the code that we can use to dynamically format the measure. This isn't a dynamic measure, so if I go back and set it back as currency, we see we get the warning message here we'll lose the dynamic format string if we switch it to a static format option. I'll hit change because that is okay for us now. So this is a really cool update, and it works in a similar way to when we use field parameters. So this is a different feature that I've showcased maybe last year even, where within this one chart, if I select total balance, we can see that that's what's populating these columns in the column chart. But if I switch this to count of clients, now we're getting the count of clients measure, which is formatted just as an integer and not those currency values. So if we're using measure parameter or field parameter rather, we don't need to use that dynamic format type for our DAX measure, but there may be more complicated instances where we do want to explicitly define our own logic in DAX, and now we have the ability to make something similar to this, but strictly in DAX. So I think that's a really cool update. I'm excited to get in and do some more advanced stuff with DAX to see that. And there actually is another great documentation for that here within the Microsoft documentation for creating dynamic format strings, and it walks through a really in-depth scenario for currency exchange values. So if we have a table, we have lots of different currencies in our report, and we may want to display the dollar amounts in Canadian dollars or American dollars or Japanese yen or in euros or any currency we can think of. There's kind of a step-by-step guide of how we can set that up from a data modeling perspective, from a DAX perspective, and then we can use dynamic format string measures in our report to return that information exactly how we want to see. So if this is a specific use case that you're interested in learning more about, or even if you just want to learn more about the dynamic format string feature within DAX, within Power BI, I would definitely check out this blog post as well. And then the last quick update that I liked from this feature summary was an update to the quick measure suggestions. So I believe this is now, it is still in preview, but it's no longer an experimental feature. And what this quick measures allows us to do, if I go into my Power BI report, from the Home tab on the ribbon within this calculation section, we have quick measure, and we see we have this calculations tab, so we can select a calculation, and essentially Power BI will write the DAX code for us, so we can see the average for a category that we define or variance per category. And I'm not sure why my suggestions is grayed out. Either my admin has disabled it or I'm using a live connected data model. Interesting. Okay. Well, it looks like I'm not going to be able to demo the updates to quick measure suggestions. But let me go back to the blog post. Essentially, what this allows us to do is to use natural language suggestions. So like in the example in the blog here, sales amount for California in 2020, and then we get a preview of both the answer to that question as well as the actual code for a DAX measure that will answer that question for us. So I think this quick measures feature is really aligned with a lot of the discussion around AI that's coming out with your Chat GPT or Bard or Copilot. It's AI helping you work more efficiently and more effectively, and this can actually generate DAX for you. There is a blog post for this as well, again in the Microsoft documentation for quick measure suggestions, and the part that I've scrolled down to already under limitations and considerations that I thought was quite apt. Quick measure suggestions are not a replacement for learning DAX. So you should still learn DAX. You still need to be able to audit and review these suggestions that come back for you. But it will definitely, I think, help speed up that learning curve of even just how to approach certain problems if you're unsure. But with that, those are my favorite features from this month. It's 5:20. It's time for our feature presentation, which this month is just handing it back to Ken. So thank you everybody for your time. Thank you, Ken, and happy
thank
to pass
you,
it back
Joseph.
to you.
Appreciate it, and thank you once again for doing the what's new for us. I genuinely appreciate your willingness to do this all the time. It makes my life a lot easier. I was wondering if there was actually a third reason why that thing might show up or might not show up for you with a quick message suggestion that's probably not listed as Teams stole all your bandwidth, so Power BI thinks you're offline. That might be the other one, right? So.
Well, that's true. Maybe I'll test that after the session.
There you go. Anyhow, all right. Let us move into managing expense reports with Power Query and Excel for today. So welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining. And I'll let you know that as I'm going through this presentation, I have my chat window open on the right-hand side. I will be trying to watch that. So if there's any questions that come up or whatever else, please, don't hesitate to bomb them in there. I'm also going to just quickly go and drop a link in here as well. So this is actually the link where you can download the slide decks and the sample files for what's actually happening here. If you're interested in playing around with this afterwards, there is a begin file, there's a complete file, and the data files that I'm working with, as well as the slide deck itself. Now, for those of you who don't know me, I am an FCPA, FCMA. I have my accounting designation. I've had it for quite some time. This is a picture back when I used to have more hair than I do today. It was actually one that was taken for the CPA way back when. I do run a little website called excelguru.ca, which many of you have been to or have seen. So if you're interested, you can always check that out. We have a bunch of help articles. We have a free forum there as well. And I'm one of the founding partners of Skillwave Training, along with Matt Allington and originally with Miguel Escobar, who is now working for Microsoft as well. I am a Microsoft MVP, have been since 2006, have been re-awarded every single year. I originally started in Excel, spent some time in Data Platform, which is the category that looks after Power BI. I'm now back in what is officially, I believe, called M365 Apps and Services that looks after Microsoft Office and thereby Excel. I don't have enough stuff that I play with on a regular basis, so I'm also a software developer and an author. I've written an add-in for Excel called Monkey Tools. If you've never heard of this, you will see a brief touch of what happens with some of the Monkey Tools features today. And I've written a couple of books. The first of, well, this is actually my second book, was M is for Data Monkey, which was the Excel Pro's Definitive Guide to Power Query. It has been updated and released with a new version called Master Your Data. I do frequently get questions on, hey, Ken, I've read the first one. Should I get the second book? We completely rewrote it from the ground up. So it's not just a second edition. It is a complete rewrite all the way through. It's been expanded by about 50%. There's a lot more stuff that's in there. So not only is it up to date, but it's much more comprehensive as well. So the answer to that, in my opinion, is yes. But do what you need to do, of course. All right. So that's about me. Let's move on and talk a little bit about what is happening here. So today's session that I want to look at here is actually a session that I was sort of mentioning to some people before we started this, that it actually caught me a little bit off guard, and it shouldn't have. But this is something that was actually inspired by more than one of my students that I actually had in both the self-service BI and the Excel fundamentals bootcamp products that I run for training courses. It started in Vancouver when I was actually teaching an in-person self-service BI bootcamp over 3 days, and somebody asked me about expense reporting and how they would handle this, and I gave them some ideas and whatnot. I then went and worked with another client on some Excel specific or some Power Query specific program or training, and the same question came up again: how do I actually manage my expenses? And then when I was actually doing an Ask Me Anything session in these products, I brought it up, and one of the students in the Excel fundamentals like, I need this today, like, show me more. So it's had a lot more touch points, I think, than I was actually expecting. But I thought, it makes a great example to actually share about some of the power that we have that we can actually use when we bring Power Query together with Excel and use the components together. And what's really cool about this is, even though it was originally inspired by one of my self-service BI bootcamp participants, this function that we've built into what we have here is completely approachable for somebody who's in the fundamentals area, providing they have some Power Query training. So the goal of what I've got here today that I want to show you is how to go and build a real world application to speed up expense processing. I want to showcase some really cool Excel and Power Query tips that you may not know. And I'm going to try and do this primarily through the user interface driven methodologies with only minor code edits along the way here. And part of the reason for this is that I'm really trying to make this compatible for somebody who is more at the fundamentals level than they are into the hardcore coder level. And reality is, in this case, is that there's a lot less hardcore coders than there are people that are actually working with these tools on a regular basis, just trying to get their job done. So that's the goals of what I actually have to do here. And the business problem that I'm actually looking at specifically is how to code your monthly visa expenses so that you can get them off to accounting and not have them come back to you again. Basically, what you get on a monthly basis, we're going to make this assumption here, is you can download a monthly transaction listing from the bank. I've got a couple of these that I've got that have been downloaded and sanitized a little bit in order to show you some real world style transactions. They arrive in a poor format. This is the problem, is that, you know, banks sometimes give us things that aren't the most approachable. So I'll show you what I actually have here. And what I'm looking for is I want to import the data and automate as much of the coding of the actual solution as I possibly can. Now, we can always take it further than what I'm going to show you. There's no question there, but this will sort of give you an idea as to what kinds of things we can do here. And ultimately, at the end of the day, I want to produce a printable report that I can stick in front of the accountant, so the accountant will be happy and not come back to me and ask me to redo it and add more information. The other thing that I want to do is I want to set this up so effectively the vendor invoice is not limited to the simply the Visa account. No, I mean, it's not. I mean, the whole sort of concept behind this thing is it's not limited to just Visa statements by any stretch. I mean, you could do this with other things as well. But for me, I mean, that's the sort of the approach that I've actually taken here. So so the last thing that I want to sort of introduce into this is that when I first go and code a Visa statement, I'm going to have gone shopping at certain locations. But when I go and code it next month, I'm probably going to have some locations that are the same, but some that are different. And I want to build a system that learns or that can be taught at any rate, so that when I only go to a place every 3 or 4 months, I don't have to keep on telling it what's going on. I want it to actually learn from what's happening in the past. So that's another one of my goals that I have here, is to try and make this dynamic so that I can build it up and eventually automate it almost as much as possible out of this thing if I can. Now, we're going to jump into demos. I'm going to get out of the slide deck for a while here. And I'm going to show you the files that I'm actually working with here. I've done a little bit of work in setting up a basic template of some of the stuff that I'm actually playing around with. So I've got my expense page that I'm dealing with here. Ultimately, these are the column headers that I'm going to be bringing in here. I'm going to show you right now, if I go and take a look at my queries and connections, there are absolutely no queries and connections inside this particular setup of data. Right now, I have one table of data here, which is a table which is called account codes, that lists the account names that I want somebody to pick from and assign to my transactions, and a code that it is going to return back to them. And you will notice this is an Excel table, which means you can always add more codes as you potentially need them. Okay, so the summary page is where we're going to build our report for our accountant, and there we go. Now, what kind of data are we working with? Well, you know what? We're going to see that as we go along. So the first thing is, my goal is to be able to drop all of my Visa transactions when I download them into a folder. And every month I want to grab a new transactions file, throw it into the folder, and I want to hit the refresh button. And I only want the most recent month. That's all I'm interested in, because I'll have already processed February by the time I get to March. So I am doing a little bit of maintenance on my side. When I save these files, I am actually prefacing it with a date, and I am using an ISO date, and there's a reason why I'm doing this. So this is a year, month, day format. Okay, so I am specifically naming it this way, and you're going to see why that is when we start getting into a little bit more of the advanced components. But right now, there's one file in the folder, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and start building this solution here. This is going to be very demo heavy here in this particular one. So we're going to go get data from file, from folder, using Power Query. And this will take me to the folder. Normally I would have to browse for this, but I've already been here. So I'm going to go and pick up the data folder and say open. And now it tells me, hey, you've got one file in here. What would you like to do with it? So naturally, I am going to always, if you come to one of my courses, you'll know we hit the button to the left of cancel. That is the default that we want. Transform data, in this case, where there are 4 buttons. And this is going to open me up into Power Query. Now, the first thing Yeah, but combine is highlighted in green. Joseph's right. Yeah, they always highlight the wrong defaults in this kind of stuff, unless there's only an OK and a cancel button, right? Anyhow, so there you go. So button to the left of cancel is the default you always want in a Power Query dialog, whether there are 2 buttons, 3 buttons, or 4 buttons, it is always the button to the left of cancel. All right, so I'm inside the Power Query editor. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to bigify this a little bit so that folks can actually see it. If you don't know the keyboard shortcut for this, it's Control-Shift+ will actually bigify, Control-Shift- will actually minify a little bit here. Melinda, we haven't even got into the pain yet. All right, and the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and start building up one of the techniques I teach in the Power Query Academy and the Self-Service BI boot camps. I'm going to future-proof my solution a little bit. And this is just a couple of different steps here. We're going to go through and we're going to transform and force our extension to lowercase just to make sure that nobody can start dropping in files that have a caps lock on them. And I'm going to filter to only text files for reference. If I want only text files, just to future-proof this, if I uncheck select all, it gives me this. If I check text, it checks select all. This is kind of irritating. I can go through and set up manual filters this way, but we can also just right-click on the data point and say I want a text filter equals, and that will set up a filter where the extension equals .txt. So that's nice and easy. Don't have to type anything. The next thing I want to look at here is that I'm only interested in the date from the file name. So you'll notice when I click on this, it brings up my text down the bottom. I'm going to go grab everything, including the space before Visa, Control-C. We're going to go right-click, replace values. We're going to drop this in here, and we're going to replace it with nothing. There we go. Now we've just got the date here, which I can change to be an actual date. Okay, so I now know that I have the content of the file, which is this binary here, and I've got the date that that file represents. I don't actually need anything else over here, so I'm going to grab content and date, right-click, and remove other columns. And at this point, I have a nice little files list. So we're going to go and call this one files list. There we go. That's a list of all of the files that are in the folder, all one of them. And before I go any further here, I am going to go through and just do a little bit of organization to keep myself organized. I'm going to create some new groups. I always like to have a group called data model. That's where I load stuff, whether it goes to a worksheet or not. I still call it data model. I'm going to make a group called staging queries. And I'm going to make a new group here, which is called raw data connections. These are the ways that I generally like to structure my stuff. I have my raw data connections at the bottom, and I treat this like a tree. This is where the deepest roots are, and they grow up to the beautiful foliage that is the data model that we actually put on our worksheets or in the data model. Files list is my raw data connection, so I'm going to go and throw that in here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to leverage this. So I'm going to right-click on this and reference it. And I'm going to rename this. We're going to call it something insightful like transactions. This is going to load to the data model. And what I'm going to do with this right now is I'm just going to go and combine all these files. And if you've never seen this in action before, you should totally come to one of my courses because we teach this in virtually every single one of them. But the idea here is it's going to combine all one file in a folder together. Okay, you think, why would you do that? Well, because I'm going to have multiple files by the time I'm done with this. So here we are. We're going to say, okay, sure, we'll take this particular thing. And at this point, it's going to blow up with a whole bunch of new stuff over here. Now, here's the deal, though, is that this guy belongs in my staging queries, and I really don't care about seeing the helper queries. I'm just going to go collapse that. There are 3 queries here that are super important. Files list, that gives me my list of files. Transactions, that gives me the output of the combined files. But this leverages the transform sample right here. The big difference, this is all files. This one is a sample of one specific file. And the most appropriate place to go and do your data cleanup is as close to the data source as possible. And that means in this single file where I've got one thing that I can actually do my work on. So here's what I'm going to do with this. I'm going to go and look at this and promote my first row to headers. And you'll notice at this point that my data is not in a very good format. It's stacked right now. It goes date, vendor amount, date, vendor amount. This is what we actually call a stacked data pattern. And I need to pivot this to get it out of here. So I'm going to show you a pattern here that we have in, again, virtually every one of the courses that I teach, which is called our pivoting stack data pattern. It works like this. So I'm not going to explain it here, but just for reference, I'm going to go through it quickly. We have an index in this particular case here that gives us a row from 0 to 5. I'm going to go and add myself a divide integer. I'm going to use the magic number, which represents the first row of the second transaction. That gives me something that looks like this, 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1. We come back to index, transform this to be a modulo. We're going to use the same number. And again, if you come to one of my courses, we teach you how the pattern of this whole thing works. And then we're going to do the magical piece where we actually pivot the index column. We go to advanced options. Oops, don't aggregate. And we say, okay. All right. And just like that, boom, we've now pivoted it into the right order. So I can come over here, delete the integer division column, rename this to a date, rename this to vendor. Always helpful to be seeing what you're doing when you put your mouse right on top of things. And there we go. We'll go with amount. All right. Now, so this has pivoted my data out. So it's now got a date, a vendor, amount column, and that's exactly what I need for things. So this is good, but the data types are incorrect. Everything's text. So I'm going to go press Control-A to select all my columns. And on the Transform tab, I'm going to detect data types. And what will happen now is Power Query adds me a change type step, and it takes its best guess as to what kinds of data I have here. So it says, well, the dates look like dates. It formats them with italics and sticks them on the right-hand side. That's cool. Vendor looks like text. That's all good. Amount looks like a 1.2. I'm like, well, I mean, it does, but I would actually prefer this to be an official currency. So I'm going to change this and say currency. The big difference between a decimal number and a currency for reference is that even though this is only showing 2 decimal places here, a currency gets rounded off to 4 decimal places maximum, and a decimal number can carry up to 15 decimal places. So I actually want to round it out to proper currency here. Now, the last thing that's kind of important on this is that all these numbers are negative. I don't really want that, so I'm going to transform the column for my amount, standard, multiply, and I'm going to multiply it by -1. And there we go. We've now transformed this stacked file into a proper looking little table. Now, one of the things I want to be clear about when you're actually building a solution like this is that the data transformations that you do to your files that you get everybody's are going to be different, because it completely depends on what your bank actually gives you or what your system gives you that you're going to serve up. So you need to figure out the steps to go through and deal with that kind of stuff. Again, if you need help with that, come take one of my courses, because honestly, we can teach you all the different techniques to unwind things. I'm now going to move back to the transactions query. So what typically happens, or what absolutely happens here, is we generate a files list, and then for every one of the files in the list, we invoke a function that uses this pattern and then stack them all together in this one. You can see we've got an error here. It says the column 1 of the table wasn't found. And if I step back to the previous step, you'll notice that we have a date, a vendor, and an amount column. We do not have a column 1. We did when we first combined it. And Power Query hard codes that step in there. So to get rid of this, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to delete the change type step. And at that point, this looks a little bit better here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to continue on with my process. Now I need a couple of other columns for my coding. Okay, so this is the data that came in, but I need to add a new column for GST. If you're not a BC-based resident, this is the goods and services tax, which is what we use in BC. In other parts of Canada, we use HST. In some provinces, we don't have GST. We don't have HST. Actually, no, I think that's not true. I think we all have HST somewhere. But regardless, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to fill this in with a null. Now, this drives me crazy. Null is a keyword. It means empty. Null.type is a conversion function. Notice there is no lowercase null in this list. It drives me crazy. If I hit escape, this is the appropriate thing to do. And what I will now get is I'll get a column that says GST null null. That is what I need. That IntelliSense really needs some work. I'm going to add another column at this point in time, custom column right here. And this one here, I'm going to go and call this one account name. And again, I'm going to type in null. Go and say OK. Now, just a quick little trick here along the way is that you'll notice that it is recording all the steps that I'm doing, but these two here are not the most descriptive steps, I guess. Added custom 1. So I'm going to actually go back and rename this first one here, and I'm going to call this one added GST. And I'm going to call this one here. We're going to right click and rename this. We're going to call this one added account name. And that's going to be a little bit easier for me to take a look at the audit trail steps to figure out what was going on previously if I come back and need to make any modifications. I'm now going to go and add another column that I need. This is going to be an index, but I'm not going to start from 0. I'm actually going to start from 1 this time. And now you'll see that transaction number 1 gets line item 1, transaction 2 gets line item 2, but I'm not loving the fact that this is called index. Now I could totally double click on this or right click it and rename it, but that's going to add me another step down here. Actually, that's kind of an ugly name anyway. Let's rename that one. Let's call this one added line number. But I'd rather this be called line. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to make a minor tweak to the formula up here where it says this index up the top here. I'm just going to type this in as line and replace those within the quote. So this actually just does it all in one step. There's no point in creating it and then renaming it if I can just create it with the right name to begin with. I kind of wish you'd get prompted for that, when you're doing it in the first place. But regardless, it is what it is. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to reorder these columns. And I don't usually do this. Normally, when I'm loading data, I'm actually loading into the data model. So the order of the columns really doesn't matter. But in this case, I'm actually loading it out to an Excel table to function as my report. So in this case, it does matter to me. So I'm going to move line all the way to the beginning. There we go. So we've got line, we got data, vendor, amount, GST, and account name. So that's good. The only problem is a bunch of these are defined with ABC 1, 2, 3 data types. That means any, it means not defined. That's problematic. So we're going to go press Control A, select everything, transform, detect data type. Power Query will now go through and make its best guess as to what the data types need to be. Line, it says this looks like an integer, so we'll give it a whole number, no problem. Date, it's giving me the calendar icon. I'm happy with that. Vendors, text, amount, 1.2. Now, I'd mentioned before I like currency, so I'm going to go with currency on that. And GST, it hasn't even figured anything out because it's just full of nulls. So let me grab these two columns, right click, change type. We'll change both of these to a currency. And it says, do you want to add it as a new step or replace current? I'm going to replace the ones that are there because they weren't very good. Sometimes you need to do things as add new step, but not in this case. Finally, account name. I would say it's probably a safe guess to say that this one can probably be text. And there we go. We've now got a nice change type step all added up inside this. Now, at this point, I'm going to look at my steps here for a second, though, and I'm going to say, there's some other things that I might want to do later here. So I'm actually really regretting doing all of this in one big, long query here. I'm okay with the added line number from this point forward and reordering of columns and change type. I'm okay with doing that in this query, but I really wish I'd done all of this in a query that feeds into this one. So here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to added line number. I'm going to right click and I'm going to extract previous. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to extract this into a query, which is called staging-transactions. And what you'll see now is that my query that I'm in, which is transactions, has a source of staging transactions. It adds its line number, reorders the columns, and does its change type. So those last three steps are being done here, but everything else happened in my source, which is staging transactions. And if I go back to staging transactions, this is the steps that we actually had. We originally referenced files list. When I combined files, Power Query filtered hidden files, invoked our custom function, removed all the columns, and then expanded the table. This is what it does for us. And then I added my GST and my account name columns. So I'm doing this in a staging layer, which I'm going to move into my staging transactions here. And I just like to break things apart a little bit. I find it makes it more manageable, especially when you need to make some modifications to things a little bit later. If we go and take a look at the query dependencies view now, we should be able to see the flow of what's actually going through here. So we have our files list, we have a sample file that's going to be fed to staging transactions and goes through to the transactions table at the end of all this stuff. So it follows this sort of flow here. These guys are not really well documented the way they actually work, but they actually feed the transform function file. So this should actually feed to this, which feeds to this, which feeds to this. It should actually be spinning out this way, but it's all good enough. All right. The important thing is I've got a nice table here that I can now go and say home, close and load. I should mention all of my queries by default, I load to connection only. And that way, when I create multiple queries all in one session, they all load very, very quickly. And then I can then say, I want to take the one query that I care about out of all those queries that I built, and I'm going to load this to an existing worksheet right here. If I use the default load behavior, when I hit close and load, it would actually only give me one option to choose, and then it would create new worksheets for all of them. And I don't want to see that. I only want this one particular query in place here. So let me just collapse that. That's good. And now we can look at my table. So I've got my 2 records. You'll notice that I had actually put a little header here of the fields that I want. So I'm really looking for a net column here. And I'm just going to add that to my table. You'll notice the table expands because it is a table. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say equals the amount minus the GST, and that will give me my net expense. Of course, because it's a table, everything fills down. We're using the same formula all the way through, which is great. I'm now going to go and take a look and add my account column. And the idea here is that we're going to do an X lookup. We're going to go and look up the account name, and we're going to look it up in the accounts name column of the account codes table, and we're going to return the matching account code. And if we can't find it for whatever reason, what we're going to do with it at that point in time is we're going to go and put in an alternate piece of text, and that is going to be equal to code required. So at this point, because there's nothing in the account name, it comes back and it tells me that there is a code required. Okay, fair enough. It looks like I've got all the headers that I need here, so I don't need this row anymore. This was just done to sketch things out, so I'll delete that. But I'm not really happy with my header here. Right now, I've got some efficient entity and Visa transaction details, but it says for the month ending ... So I need to fix this. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go with EO month. If you don't know this formula, this returns the end of the month for a range of dates or a single date. I'm going to go with max, and we're going to pull the maximum from this date column here. So in this case, it should give me February 27th. I'm going to tell it I want the end of the month 0 months away. So give me the end of the current month. And when I do that, I get an awesome result of 44,985, which isn't the most useful thing. So I'm going to actually wrap this entire EO month thing in a nice little formula called text. I'm going to put in a quote to tell it that I want MMMM, which is the full month name, DD, which is a 2-digit date or day, YYYY, which is a 4-digit year, close the parenthesis off, and boom, there we go. I've got February 28th. Melinda, I can see your hand is raised. What you got for me?
Okay, so I do my boss's American Express things, and they cut off like around the 17th or 18th of the month.
Sure.
But doing what you did, let's say his last transaction was on the 15th.
Yep.
My heading up there needs to be the date that the statement closed, which would be the 18th.
So if you've got that kind of a thing going on in place in this, what I would probably do is in the transaction, or actually in the staging transactions query, when I go back through this, what the process is that happens in this is we go through, we look at our source, we combine the files, right? So it filters out hidden files, it invokes this custom function, which gives us the table of items that we are getting back from our transform sample. What Power Query then does is it actually removes other columns. So it gets rid of all these. But you can always come to the gear icon and say, hey, look, you know what? I don't want to get rid of the date column. I want to keep that one around. Now, I'm not going to do this because this will blow up the example that I've got carefully architected for everything here. But in this way, you'd be able to hold on to that date and have it as part of your files list that you actually bring out. What I would probably do at that point is I would probably say, hey, let's reference that query and actually just like try and hold on to that date for, and put it out into a 1-cell table somewhere else. And then you can actually reference that to drive what was the latest date that actually happened. Does that make sense? Hopefully.
Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
No worries. Okay. So the good news about this is that when this updates, and I'm now looking at, say, March 27th, this should update for the month end for me. If you're pulling it from another table, you can obviously get it to go from there, but there we go. That looks good. I can work with that. Now, The next part of this is that I really like to make it very obvious where I want people to focus their attention. Now, you could probably look at this and say, well, geez, Ken, it's the empty holes. What's the problem with that? Well, you know what? That's cool and everything else, but I like to make it even more obvious, giving people a hand up. So here's the deal. I'm going to go and change the table design right now. I'm not really a big fan of using the default green here. I'm going to make it blue. Because green actually is something that's very specific for me. Green means go. This is what I tell all my users when I build the spreadsheets is if there's a cell that's in green, it means it's a data entry cell. You can go and you can use that. If it's not green, you might be able to, but you got to think about it and know why it is. So green is the inviting part. So what I'm going to do with this, I'm now going to go and say, let's go to the Home tab and let's build a conditional format, new rule, use a formula to determine which cell to formula. And I'm going to go and build a formula that looks like this. I'm going to start with and. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to check, first off, if the row number for this cell, B6, and I do need to make this relative because I'm going to copy this formula or format that's going to extend to the next column. So I need to have an absolute column, but a relative row because the formula needs to say pointing at B when it moves this way, and it needs to move to row 7 when it moves down here. Okay, so we're going to go $B6, close the parenthesis on that. So if we look at this, the row number on this one here is 6. What I'm going to do is I'm going to check if it's greater than 5. Okay, so in this case, that should be true. In addition to that, what I'm also going to check is whether or not this cell, and once again, we're going to lock in the column, but not the row. I'm going to check if the value of it is greater than 0. Why is that? Well, because when I apply this formula, it's also going to get applied to this cell here. And I don't want to have it showing up as an input cell below my table. I only want the input cells in the table highlighted. You'll see how this works in just a second. Let me choose my format. It's going to be a fill with nice light green. I'm going to say OK and OK. And there we go. We've got one cell that's colored in a beautiful light green to invite user input. Now I need to apply this to all of the cells in this area. I don't love what I'm about to do. Okay, I want to be clear on this thing here because usually I try and keep things very targeted to the specific ranges, but in this case, it's actually easier and more stable to do something slightly different. This is one of the things I try to avoid at all costs, but I'm going to apply it to the entire column F and column G. Normally, I don't like doing this. This actually sets up a conditional format that can potentially run for 1 million rows. So it could have a big performance penalty if you start creating rows, 1 million rows down the spreadsheet. The reason I'm doing this, though, is because if you apply it just to the table range and you do a refresh, you can actually end up with fractured ranges inside here. And if you apply it to the entire column, that doesn't happen. So when we go and say apply at this point, you can see it's now applied it nicely there. And if I say OK, I've now got a couple of cells that are nicely shaded in green, ready to go. All right, what am I going to do next? Oh, yeah, let's do a little formatting. So we're going to grab these columns, set them as a comma style. That looks a little bit nicer. Cool. I'm going to resize all the columns of my table here. Column width is going to be 10, except for this one, which is going to be 45. This one is going to be 20. How did I work that out? Trial and error until I found the right sort of mix for what I'm actually thinking is going to be working. Now, see what we can do here. Let's code this. Can you use the table column references for the conditional formatting? I don't believe you actually can. I have to go back and test that, Nick, but I'm pretty sure that that's not the case. I think you've always had to go back to A1 style referencing. If anybody can tell me I'm wrong, I would love to know that. All right, I'm going to code this right now. We're going to go 1535 for our GST. We're going to put this to hotel. You can see it nicely comes back and gives me the account code. That's brilliant. Let me go and put this one 920, and I'm going to type in food for this one here. It's a DoorDash thing, and it tells me that code is required. Now, the problem is I don't know all the account names off the top of my head. So what I want to do with this is I want to actually build a data validation list that I can use to pick from these listings. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to go data, validation, and I'm going to choose to use a list. And the source range that I want is I actually want to pick up, and this is really frustrating. When I click on the table, you'll notice it highlights the range, but you'll notice it gives me absolute reference. And the problem with this is if the table is on the same worksheet, if you add a new row to the table, it will automatically pick it up. But if the table is on a different worksheet, it will not. So this will not cater for expansion, which is really frustrating. So I'm going to cancel this for a second. We come over here. I'm going to select this range. Yeah, I know, Joseph. It's weird, but bugs are, well, they're bugs. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the range, and I'm actually going to type up in the name box here and give this a range, accounts. You'll notice it disappeared. If I come over here, I can click on accounts. It'll take me there. There we go. That looks good. And if I go and check the formula name manager, you'll notice here's accounts, and it's actually got this formula: account codes, square brace, account name. I would love to use that formula in the data validation list, but you can't. But you can use this one, which points to this one. Okay, so this is the hacky workaround for this kind of thing. So here we go. We're going to go back to data. We're going to go to data validation list, and we're going to say equals accounts. Brilliant. And now I'm going to go and set up it's not circular reasoning so much. It's the fact that when you have a name, it's actually evaluated using the evaluate function. So it actually does some dynamic checking of what's actually going on there. So it's a hack, it's a workaround. But you know what? What is Excel if not a world of hacks and workarounds, right? So here we go. All right, I'm going to do a special little data validation here. I'm not going to do a blocking stop, which is what the normal is. I'm going to go with warning. And my warning says, I don't see this account in the normal listing. Are you sure you want to use it? Okay, so I think that's all spelled correctly. So here's what's going to happen with this one now is this is going to allow you to put in something and override it if it's not found in the table. Why would you ever want to do that? Well, the reason is because maybe I decided to pay our property tax by credit card. And it comes back and says, look, you don't see this in the normal listing. Why? Well, because I'm a department manager. This isn't in my normal cause of business to do, but somebody asked me to do it. So yeah, I'm going to say yes. It's still going to give me a code required, but you know what? Now this is the accountant's problem. I'm going to put it to them and say, look, it's property tax. I told you what it is. I don't have the code for that. Can you please take care of it? And that's a fair thing to actually do in this case. Now, of course, that's not going to be the case here for DoorDash. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and type in food. And this is actually relatively new. I'm actually getting autocomplete on my data validation list. I am not sure if this has actually escaped from the insider builds yet on this one. I kind of wish Win Hopkins was here because he's right up on that kind of stuff and usually tells me on these, but I don't see him on with me. So regardless, if it's not in your Excel version, it will be coming soon. But you can see that when I press tab now, it auto completes, and there we go. I've got food and beverage showing up in this thing. So that's pretty cool. And if I were to go back now and add a new account to this, so let's just go and put in this one here. If I go back, you can see that this is now showing up in my listing as well. So that's pretty darn cool. Now, let me just undo that awful name. There we are, and leave this here. Actually, here's what I'm going to do with this one real quick, is I'm now going to go and actually delete this because I need to have my code required when I go to build my report. Can we amend this expense spreadsheet to allow for the 50% rule for entertainment? Only 50%. Okay, how do you identify yourself as a Canadian accountant? You ask about the 50% rule as far as what's being able to allowed to be claimed on an entertainment basis. Yeah, so if you architect it that way, then yes, you can. I have not architected it that way, all right? So that is an additional level along the way of things that go into it, Shirley. It's a great question, but I haven't actually built this to actually go through in that particular format. I would have to think about how I would actually want to make it and get that done. All right, I'm going to finish sort of cleaning this one up here. So I'm going to go hide this column here. I don't need to see the line number. I'm also, believe it or not, even though this says code required, you'd think that would be a touch point that I need to know about. I'm actually going to hide that column. Not really interested in seeing it. And then just to make the accountant super happy here, I'm going to go to page layout, and I'm going to set this to print to 1 page wide by as many pages tall, because one thing that I know about accountants is in a paperless world, we will still print paper. And there we go. We'll make sure that it always fits. Okay, so that looks good so far. So Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and start building my report. So here's how this is going to go. What do you use to report on a range of tabular data? Well, naturally, you're going to use a pivot table because that's what they're for. So let's go, you know what, you can do this through the Insert Pivot Table tab, but I kind of like to use Monkey Tools. So we're going to go Monkey Tools from Table and Range. For reference, this does the exact same thing as if you use the regular Insert button because I just hijacked Microsoft's. So we're going to go click on our summary page, and I'm going to drop this right up here. And boom, there we go. I've got a beautiful pivot table 1 that is ready for some input. So I'm going to go and quickly drag my fields in here. So account is going to go on rows, and then we're going to have our account name, our date, our vendor, and then our amounts, our GST, and our net. And that pivot table looks freaking horrible. So the first thing that I can't stand about this is that this is in compact form. Everything's smashed into one thing with cascading layers. Absolutely gross. Rob Colley, if you're listening, I still don't like it. Here we go. We're going to go to the design tab and we're going to go fix this. I'm going to report this and change this out into a tabular form. And boom, there we go. That looks much better right off the bat. So let me go and just resize those columns there. There we are. Now it looks better, but it's still tabular, which is fine, but it's got a lot of repeats of values here that I don't need to see. This will drive my accountant crazy as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start changing the format of this one a little bit. We're going to go to design. I do want subtotals on my account codes, but I don't want subtotals on the account name or the date. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to turn my subtotals off on the pivot table completely. So we'll just do not show. And then I can come back to the account and say right click and subtotal just the account. Okay, now I've only got one line item for each thing here, so it's, you know, kind of looks a little bit bloated, but trust me on this, this will look better when we start playing around with more of them. Now, there's a couple of other things that I want to do to my pivot table just to get it set up and make it look, you know, decent along the way here. The first thing I'm going to do is configure some global options. I'm going to right click in my pivot table and go to pivot table options. For empty cells, I'm going to show 0. If somebody doesn't fill in the GST field, it needs to have a 0 in it. Okay. If you want to drive your accountant crazy, send them something that's got holes in it because the data is incomplete. The other thing, I'm going to uncheck the auto fit column widths on update. I hate it when my pivot tables are constantly resizing all the time when I refresh them. I don't want that. Finally, the other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to display, and I'm actually going to uncheck the box that allows these plus minus controls on here. I don't think that they're very necessary. They're just extra clutter. So I'm going to get rid of those. Ideally, I'd really also like to get rid of these drop-down arrows. The problem is that I can't get rid of the drop-down arrows because if I uncheck the box that controls the filter drop-downs, it also wipes the field captions. I don't know why these two things were rolled up into one command. So I'm going to leave those there because I do need to sort of see some stuff as I'm going along the way here. So there we go. We've made some changes that are kind of invisible to what we have right now, but it's okay. Let me see. Let me continue making some changes here. I'm going to sort my columns Z to A. I'm doing this to bring the code required right up to the top to make sure that if there's anything that's missing, we know about that first. I'm going to go and select this blank value here. I don't need to see this blank in here. I'd rather see an actual blank. I can't get a real blank, but I can put in a space bar and hit enter. And at that point, it will treat it as if it's blank, or at least for all intents and purposes. And I'm also going to get rid of this line that says grand total. Don't really care. Space, enter. That takes care of that as well. Let me see here. A little bit of formatting our numbers. Right click, number format. Please never do this. Never select it and hit the comma style because when your pivot table expands and collapses, if you do this, you may not get all of the cells and it may not follow your pivot table. If you right click and format one cell like this, it will. Notice I did one cell, it gets the whole column. Here's the ones that drives the accountants crazy, misaligned decimals. I'm giving you all the tips to drive your accountants nuts, just so you know. So use your powers for good. But here we go. We'll set that one up and we'll do this one as well. So we'll go with accounting here and perfect. Okay. Now, the next thing that I want to sort of call out on this, and this is something that a lot of people don't know about pivot tables, is that when you work with this, I'd really like to see a couple of other features on this. I'd like a blank line between code required and 5020. Okay. The problem is that if I go to design and I go to blank rows and I say insert blank line after each item, it's going to give me a blank row after each item. And I don't want that. I only want it on the account column. In addition, I'm not loving the fact that these are actually on the same layer as the code required. I actually want to see code required, and then I want some blank space that kind of treats as a blank header before we get into the actual detail of things. Now I can get that layout by going into outline form, but the problem is this staggers too much, right? Now it's cascading down, and that's what I don't want. So I'm going to go back here. So here's something that a lot of people don't know is you can actually control these kinds of features on a field by field basis. So we can go right click, go to field settings on my code required here. Let me bring this back up on screen. And under layout and print, I can say I'd like to insert a blank line after each item label. So it's going to basically say after every one of these, put in a blank row. But it's not going to put in a blank row after every one of the other items. Okay, so now we got code required total. We got a blank line before we move into 5020. Now the next one I want to do is I want to drop this down a row, but not this. I'm going to go to hotel. I'm going to click on the field settings. Bring that up again. We're going to go to layout and print. And it says, would you like to show my item labels in tabular form? So item label is the next field. I'm going to say I want to show the next field in outline form, and I do not want the subtotals. And what you can see now is that we've got a blank row after our code required. We go into 5020, and these two rows drop down to the next one. Now, this might look a little bit airy with just, you know, a couple of pieces here. It seems a little bit staggered, but it's not as bad as it was before. Okay. The other thing that's entirely possible is that let's think about our DoorDash receipt here. On February 27th, I was obviously staying in Vancouver here, so it's entirely possible that I might have had multiple DoorDash receipts or multiple restaurant meals in a single day. If that happens, I'm going to see, let's say there's an Earl's restaurant. Well, that's Earl's right there. Let's say it's Joey on this line here. I would have one date and a blank next to this particular piece. So I want to also make sure I'm repeating item labels for my dates. So I'll go and repeat item labels. And I'm also, because I know that there's going to be a change I'm making later, going to do the same thing on this guy here, repeat item labels. Okay, so that gets the pivot table mostly set up the way that I want here. But there's a couple of things that I do want to still just sort of play around with here. I think the column widths look like they're probably okay. What I'm not, oh, actually, no, they're not. Here we go. I'm going to shorten this one up to just enough to show code required. This one here, I'm actually going to change the column width to 2. And you'll notice that we actually get a little bit of an overlap with the next row. I'm going to make this one a little bit shorter as well. I don't need quite that much room for the date, so we can even see a little bit of overlap on this. I can't do this with code required because this is a blank cell, so this will actually cut this off. I wish I could bring this all the way back, but unfortunately, no. So we've got to make sure our D is showing there. But that looks a little bit better. The problem is I've still got all these arrows and things in the headers, so here's what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this header, and I'm not even going to bother trying to fight with the pivot table header. I'm going to go and format this row right here and hide this one. I can then go and say, hey, cool, we can change that. I can drive these by formulas if I wanted. Maybe I'll center this one. And no, I don't like that centered. There we go. That looks better. Okay. So at this point, I've now got a nice little pivot table that looks pretty good based off of the coding input that I've done over here. Okay. Oh, one more thing. Just about forgot. Page layout, set it to 1 page wide by 1 page tall so that when we print it for the accountant, it all fits. Okay, important stuff. Cool. So we're now at the stage where we've got a coding template and we've got our report that comes out the other day. But of course, pivot tables have a challenge. When I go back to the data sheet and I say, hey, you know what? This one here is actually a food and beverage expense. And I go back to the summary page, of course, this still says code required. So the reality is that I now need to go through and do a data refresh on this. Now, I can absolutely refresh the pivot table, which will bring it all back nicely here. Everything looks good there. That's cool. Or I could potentially do a data refresh all, right? All good. Or is it? When we go back to the data tab right now, after I've just done the data refresh all, my coding template has been wiped out. The reason for this is because by default, when you refresh a file, the pivot cache updates first, and then the Power Queries update second. And that is completely the wrong order for what we need to have happen. Now, if you're loading to the data model, that's not an issue. One refresh does it all. But I'm going to show you a trick how we can fix this. And actually, I'm going to show you another trick here too, because this is a little bit subtle. You might not recognize this, but the column widths on my table from Power Query have all changed. These things used to be 10, 45, 10, 10, 20, and 10, and they're not anymore. So let's set them back to where they were. Okay, so we're going to go column width, 10 on everything. This one was 45, and this one was 20. Okay, that's what they're supposed to be when we refresh the file. And here's how you can actually make sure that it stays that way. We go to Table Design, Properties. This also has an auto fit. Just uncheck the Adjust Column Width, and there we go. Now, that looks good. Here's the next piece. The trick for making sure when you refresh your all, it does the pivot table as well, is to do this. Right-click on the query, Properties, and uncheck Enable Background Refresh. Now, here's the deal. Let's go back and put in our information here. So this was a hotel, this one was 920, this was food and beverage. So now, when I go back over to my summary page, you can see that this is all coded, but that's because it wasn't, or I didn't actually completely clear it out last time. So let me just refresh this again. Okay, so we can see that when we're refreshing from the data page, we are getting these values here. But now, if I hit Data, Refresh All, notice the pivot table's gone to code required. Everything's been wiped out because all of this got wiped out. Now that sort of helps us, right? Because now we know when we're refreshing the file, the pivot table is being reset, and that is the appropriate behavior, but we need to find a way to be able to go through and actually code things so that the user can actually update these things without having it be a super confusing experience. So here's what I'm going to do for this. I'm actually going to record 2 macros using VBA. These are not going to be very complicated. So on my developer tab, if you don't have this, by the way, right click, customize your ribbon, check the box next to developer. It's shipped like this since Excel 2010. They hide it from you so that you don't have this power, okay? So once you check that box, you get the developer tab. And then basically what we do is we say record macro. And I'm going to record 2 macros. The first one here is going to be the refresh statement macro, okay? And this is going to be data, refresh all. And you can see the Power Query just did its thing there. So that's good. Back to developer, stop recording. Cool. For the next one, I'm actually going to go to the summary tab. I'm going to find my pivot table here. I'm going to record macro. This one here, I'm going to call update pivot. And what I'm going to do is from the pivot table analyze tab, I'm going to go with refresh, and I just want refresh, not refresh all. And that will refresh the pivot table, at which point I'm going to go back and say stop recording. Now, unfortunately, there is one minor code edit that I need to make to this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop into Visual Basic, open up the modules folder, because this is where things get stored inside my expense reports. And you can see here that it's actually given me my active sheet. The problem with this is that if I'm on a different worksheet and I try and run this macro and there's no pivot table on that worksheet, it's going to fail. So I actually need to just go in very quickly, rename this one here. So this is going to be the worksheets, and then within the parentheses, within quotes, we call it summary. And at this point now, no matter where I am, this macro should run. So here's how this is going to work now. Is I'm going to go back to the data tab. I'm going to go and put in my numbers again, 1535 and hotel. We're going to go 920, and we're going to go with food and beverage here. And what we should see at this point in time is that if I go and run that macro, it updates the pivot table. Except I haven't actually given myself an easy way to run the macro, so let's do that now. Insert a button from our form controls on the developer tab. This will now allow me to go and drag a box on here and pick the refresh statement. That's going to be the first one that I have. And I'm actually going to change the text on this one here to say get latest statement. I cannot type when I cannot see. There we go, that's better. And then I'm also going to go to the insert tab and grab another button over here. And this one is going to be my update pivot button. And on this one, I'm going to say, let's call this one, I don't know, update report. There we go. So if I look at summary, pivot table still says code required. If I come back over here, hit update report and go back, the pivot table is updated. That is great. If I go to data and hit get latest statement, it now blanks out this screen, refreshes the Power Query, and actually does this. Okay, so we're now back to code required, which is exactly what I want. So that's pretty cool. There is something though that I do want to just call out real quickly here, and that is that the update report button is great if the intention is that you're going to click it so you can just print everything without actually looking at the page. But the problem is that a lot of users will just jump over to summary and they don't realize that this is actually not updated. So here's a little trick to force your pivot table to update when you select the worksheet, is we can right click on the summary sheet and choose view code. This will take me into the summaries worksheet module inside VBA. And if I change general to worksheet here, it gives me the worksheet selection change event, which is totally not what I want. But I also have the ability to choose from this dropdown and pick up the activate event. I don't actually need the signature, so I'm going to get rid of it. But on this one, what I'm going to do is I'm going to type update pivot, and there we go. Now what will happen is, notice this still has code required. If I go back to data, I've already coded it. So when I click on summary, it updates automatically. So I now have the ability that when I go to review the report, it's going to update automatically, or I can click the button to update it as well. So that's actually going to work out fairly nicely along the way. Okay. Now, the next piece here is that I need to go and get my latest statement. And right now, if I go and click get latest statement, it will go and get me the latest statement in the folder because there is only one file in the folder. So what happens when I now go and say, let's bring in March? Well, let's find out. We get latest statement. Boom, we get all of our transactions because they're in the same format. So that's fantastic. There's only one problem, and that is that we've got February transactions still, and I've already dealt with those. I've already coded them. I've already sent them to the accountant. I don't want to see that anymore. So how do I sort that out? Well, in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my files list query, which gives me the list of all of the files that are in the folder. Now, as you watch, I have two files in this folder. This is only showing one. This is an important lesson with Power Query, is that you always want to refresh the preview, okay, to make sure that it's not cached. And this now gives me two files. And you'll now notice why I actually kept that date around. Because what I'm going to do is I'm now going to go and sort this in descending order. And then I'm going to keep the top one row. And this is a technique that you can use to get to the most recent file, the most recent 12 files if you're doing monthly, the most recent 24 if you're doing 2 years worth of data or whatnot. You can use this in order to go and actually grab the most recent files in the folder, which is great. What if you don't have the file name stored in there? Well, remember, the original listing of files does have a few columns for date accessed, date modified, date created. Just be really, really cautious when you're actually using these things, because I have found where these date stamps are not what you would actually expect them to be. Okay, so you want to be really, really careful about this. It is always amusing to me when I see a file where the date created is something like May 1st, but it was last modified on April 24th. And I go, I'm not sure how you can modify it before you created it. And this is one of the things I say that makes me a little bit nervous. Regardless, I'm taking my list that I had, sorting it in reverse order, keeping the first row. This now gives me the most recent file. So when I now come down here and hit get latest statement, boom, there we go. We now just have March transactions. And if I hop open to my summary table here, you'll see that I've got all of this data in there. Now, before I do that though, I'm going to ignore the GST on this kind of stuff here, but I'm very quickly going to go through and just do a little bit of coding here. So this is going to be payroll, which apparently I don't have in my expense account. That's fine. That's food and beverage. This one's travel. We're going to call Spotify office supplies. All these guys are telephone. Oops, that's not how you do that. Nope, telephone. There we go. We're going to grab food and beverage here. This one's going to be software, office, food and beverage for this guy here. This one will be telephone, and professional fees and hotel. There we go. Okay, let me update the report. Okay, now I want you to notice how many pay breaks we have in here. Okay, there's a bunch of them, and they're all on the same day. This is going to cause me a problem because when I hop over here, my pivot table by default is amalgamating all the pay breaks into one area. And if there's one thing that I know about accountants, is that they love to see detail. If they can't match this back to the exact line items on your statement, you're going to get it back and they're going to ask you to break it down. And we don't want that to happen. So how do we get all of the individual lines on this? And as it happens, that's where that little line that I added is really, really useful. So I'm going to drag this into the pivot table. It's going to make things look messy for a second. But you'll notice that it now adds this as a dimension. So we can go through and we can see pay break 1, 2, 3, all the way through on the same day. And we can see the individual amounts. As I say, it's made up a bit of a mess. So I got to clean things up. Remember, this header is actually hard-coded text. It's not, based on the pivot table. I'm not usually expecting it to be expanding and collapsing. So there we go. We're going to set those to that. We're going to set the column width to 10 on those. I'm going to hide this column because even though I need it, I really don't need to see it. And then I'm just going to clean up my headers because I'm kind of pedantic like that. And here we go. We're going to go with center across selection. Boom. And there we go. We've now got a nice little setup that shows us that there is a code required for payroll. Okay, this is something that isn't in my chart of accounts, but that's where WCB is going to go. We got some professional fees, one line item. We got some software with a couple of different line items, a bunch of telephone expenses. So we can see everything here. Notice the nice little gap between each little category there along the way too. Fantastic, looks great. I'm super, super happy with the way this is all working. Okay, so this is the basic expense report. Right? We now have the ability to say, let's pull in the latest file, refresh the thing, and we can go through and we can start coding. Great. Except for one small problem is that, yes, absolutely center across selection instead of merge and center. I would be very offended if anybody would think that I would merge and center across instead of using center across selection. We have a saying in the Excel world that friends don't let friends merge cells. So use center across selection is much better. Okay, so here's the thing. At this point in time, this is the basics, right? Like for most of what you have here, remembering that the VBA side of things is completely optional. You don't need to do that. It just makes for a better user experience here. But the main sort of thrust of this is we're combining all files from a folder, filtering to the most recent one, dropping it into a table. We've managed to hook these things together using the properties, disabling that background refresh. So when we refresh things flow between two tables. So everything looks good there. The challenge is that, Ken is, let's say, inherently lazy. Efficient. So I want to actually do a little bit better with this. And I'm just going to quickly send a quick message here to let my wife know that I am running longer than I'm expecting here. There we go. So basically what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try and see if I can actually find a way to expedite this process for coding so that I don't have to type everything in all the time. So here's the deal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to jump over to the accounts page and I'm going to expand this range of data. And you'll notice that I've got two tabular sets of data that I actually have in here, where I've actually gone and picked up a couple of different factors here. Now, the reason why I have two is because I'm working with pre-authorized payments, and I want to code my pre-authorized payments, but I also want to pick out what the GST is for some of those pre-authorized payments. Now, you might think for some of these, this is a little bit weird, like PayBright. If you're Canadian, you'd think, well, hey, you're coding this to telephone, there's got to be GST on it. But the way the financing on this stuff actually works is they make you pay the GST up front and then pay the regular payment, amortized across this. So there's actually no GST on these. But these guys, there is. It's a predictable payment every month. It's got a consistent amount of GST in it. Meanwhile, I've got something like Rogers, which is my mobile phone bill. The GST that comes out from that is highly unpredictable because it is completely dependent on the services that I have in there, how many long distance calls are made, how many text messages sent, things like that. So we've got to do something slightly different along the way here. Microsoft subscription, well, unfortunately, I've got more than one of them in here and some of them aren't exactly the same amount, so I can't code the tax on that. So I've got to do two different things here in order to feed these through. So this is going to be my static pre-authorized payments that I can actually code tax for. And then I've got variable pre-authorized payments or just generally things that I want to pre-code. To start this process, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually grab this data and I'm going to go and I'm going to put a new table on this. Now, of course, the shortcut to put a new table on something is to press Control T. And what you will notice at this point in time is that my Control T experience is slightly different than yours because I released a new feature in Monkey Tools last Friday to preface it so we can define the table name up front, including the ability to also create a connection-only query for you by default. Okay, so this is a new feature in Monkey Tools that is available to every user. It is a free feature. So here's the deal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to call this one PAP static, just because, you know what, you don't have to like my names, but I'm going to go with them. The data range is already set up correctly. My table has headers. This one, by the way, is if my friend Win were here, this checkbox is always checked. You uncheck it if you don't want it checked. Okay, so Control T, yes, there you go, Monkey Control T. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say okay. You notice it applies the style. It's made the PAP static table. There we go. So I'm also going to go through and do this one here. Actually, I should show you this actually works very similar to what you would expect from Excel. If I press Control T when I have a single piece on here, it picks up the header range. Well, that's cool and everything else, but this one here is going to be, what am I going to call this one? PAP variable. Okay, I need a different range, so I'm going to click in here and say this is the range I want. So it automatically updates that for us, and we can say okay. So at that point, we get PAP static and PAP variable, and now what I need to do is pull these into the solution to try and get my coding the way I want. So I'm going to double click on these. Open them up, and I'm going to go and do a little bit of work that I need to do to prepare these. And the first thing is I need to grab these two tables, and I need to grab my vendor and my amount and right click and remove duplicates. Okay, now you'll notice the table got shorter. Why? Well, if I go back here, PayBright has a $10.38 financing charge here and another one that's here. Neither of them have tags. Both of them are coded to telephone. It is important to have unique entries in this list. If you are trying to code to different items based on the same vendor with the same amount, don't use this. It's not going to work for you. You need to come up with a different logic, okay? But in this case here, we assume there's a one-to-one relationship between these. So we remove the duplicates, we get a nice little table like this. PAP variable, I need to go back. We can't code the same vendor to different places. Again, so I'm going to go and remove duplicates here as well, just to be safe. Both of these tables are raw data connections, so I'm just going to move them in here to be tidy. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back and I'm going to actually pull this into my data footprint. So I'm going to go back to, remember I said I like to have a staging table to make changes to different things? This is why. I'm going to look at GST and account name here. I don't need either of these because I'm actually going to generate these dynamically. So I'm actually going to delete both of these steps. Really helpful that I named them so I knew what they were. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a cool little trick here. I'm going to press the FX button to add a new step. It's called Custom 1. I'm going to right click on this one and I'm going to rename it. Actually, I'll tell you what, I'm going to do this through the properties window just so you can see it in a little bit more center screened here. So instead of Custom 1, I'm going to press Windows period. And I'm going to use this little downward button here. You can search for these kind of things, by the way. It'll show up in one of these emoji areas, but I'm going to go click on that. You'll notice it puts in a little down arrow. I'm going to do it again. Close that. And now I'm going to come back between them here. And this is going to be my default coding section. When I say OK, you'll notice I get a nice little step there. It's called default coding. All right. So now what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go and I'm going to start merging this data in. So we're going to merge queries. We're going to go and grab our PAP static, and I'm going to merge based on the vendor and the amount in both cases, because these are specific for the tax to work. It has to be merged to the correct value on the left. We'll say OK. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to expand the GST and the code 2. So here we go. We got GST. We now know where to code these two, but there's more because we also have items that don't have consistent amounts like Rogers. I want to get a coding level into this one too. So not a problem, but let's just clean up a little bit here. So instead of merged queries, let's rename this one. We'll call this one merged PAP static. The expanded, I'm not super worried about, but we're going to go back here now and let's merge the next one in. So we'll go and we'll merge our PAP variable. Grab our vendor. This time it's just vendor to vendor. That's all that matters here. We'll say OK. Rename this one here to merged PAP variable. And we're going to expand out the code 2 column here. Now, you'll also notice I've already got code 2 column. So this one becomes code 2.1. Notice For Rogers gets coded. It didn't have an account before. Microsoft, well, we have one that's hard targeted to something here, but we've also potentially got another one that I've added in saying, hey, look, if it shows up for Microsoft anything and it's not the specific amount, I want it coded to software. So I actually have duplicates in this area here. Well, I have the same value in two different columns. If I didn't have this, I could just merge these columns together and be done with it. But unfortunately, because I've got the same value in both places, I need to get a little bit more complicated. I need to add myself a new column here. And this one is going to be called, if I can actually type, account name, which might sound familiar because I've used that before. So the logic behind this guy here is if code2 equals null, so we're going to check inside this one. Then we're going to grab a new column here, and we're going to go with the code to 1. Otherwise, we're going to go and pick up the code 2 column. And what we now get is it's going to pick from this column primarily. And if it doesn't, it's going to grab this one here. Okay. So now I can go and grab these two guys here, delete them. I should probably just rename this one here, added account name. There we are, that's better. Go back here. Okay, so we have our account name that's showing up. And the beautiful thing about this, remember I did this in the staging query. And the reason why I extracted my steps exactly the way I did before is because we read from this, it has all the same column names, even though they're not in the same order. Remember, I just added a line number, reordered the columns, all the names are the same, and then changed the data type steps. So now, when I go back and say home, close, and load, if I go back over to my data page here and get latest statement, you'll notice that it preloads it with a bunch of the individual information. Notice that Rogers does not give me the GST amount because I got to go and find that one manually. But for the ones that are 0, the ones that actually have values, it's actually giving me those things properly. Now, the other Microsoft one we don't see in this particular file, but we will see it a little bit later on. Okay, so that's kind of a cool, cool little thing here. Now, the last piece that I want to cover off on this that I got asked about when I was actually demonstrating this in one of the Ask Ken sessions was, okay, Ken, but what about the names of the things that are over here? Because we've got some names that are kind of gross in this particular case, and we'd like to replace them. So what would you do with this? And there's actually 3 different things that you might do here depending on how you actually want to set these things up. Why are they all still conditionally formatting green? Because the formatting is basically checking the row number and the value over here. These are the data entry fields. I did not set this up to say, is there a value in here? You can turn it off, okay? Although if I really wanted to get jiggy with it, Kathy, I could totally do that. But I've always found it weird to have colors that change on people when they put something in, it disappears. That's not generally so bad, but I try to avoid, doing things like red where it's missing or whatnot. And I don't want them to think that they can't modify it after the fact. The reality is they can. If they figure out this transaction is actually wrong, they can come back and they can actually change it. Okay, so there you go. All right, so let's talk about these data labels. Here's method 1. We look at something on the left here and we say Wise Labs. I don't need all this thing here. This is a Wise, this is a security camera. Okay, so we can actually go, even though this is not green, we can go and we can overwrite this and we can update our report. And now when we send it to the accountant, when we go down and we look at our office, oh, sorry, this has got a code required. Actually, I haven't coded it, but we can see that it's actually picked up the description. And that's fine if we don't need to do this very often. Maybe we don't buy from this vendor very much. We can actually go and just, overwrite it here. And when we go and get the latest statement, of course, it'll just get the latest statement. It throws those away. So they're just one-time changes, okay? Nice and temporary. There's some other things that we might want to do, though. I don't really need to see DoorDash at the beginning of every one of these food and beverage receipts. In addition, anybody that sells and uses a credit card system through Square always starts off with SQ space star. I don't need to see that either. So if I want to make changes to that, what I'm going to do is I can make what we call pattern replacements by going and editing our transaction query. And what I'm going to do now is I'm again going to go in and just help my sort of documentation a little bit here. I'm going to add a new step with my FX. I'm going to go and I'm just going to rename this one on the side right here. You'll see we can do it in both places. So we're just going to go double click on those and then come back into the middle here. And this is going to be description replacements. Nice little documentation there. And then basically what I can do is I can now say, all right, let's go bigify this a little bit so we can see it. I'm going to click on this DoorDash one. This drives me crazy, by the way, too. I go and select my characters, and it does the word automatically select entire word thing. Oh, hate that. So hold down your shift key, mouse over to just what you want, Control C. Here we go. We're going to right click, replace values, and replace DD DoorDash with nothing. That'll shrink that up. And we're also going to go and replace values. I think the next one that I was looking for was this, which is SQ space asterisk. Replace that with nothing as well. So there we go. That looks a little bit better. I should probably give you an idea as to what these things are here. So I'm going to go and right click and rename this. And I'm just going to go with stripped DoorDash. Okay. And I'm going to go with stripped stripped square preface. Okay, now I can do more than this if I want as well. I can actually come back and put some properties in here and say removed SQ star from leading text. Whatever I want to do for documentation, you'll notice this gives a nice little eye that you can actually see when you mouse over it. Depends on how much effort you want to put into your documentation here as to what you want to do. Okay, so that's method 2 for this for replacement patterns, is that we can go and we can now say okay. And what you'll see is that when we go and refresh this, our where's our Bayview Brewing here? This SQ is gone. The code is the documentation. Sure, Joseph, yes. Having said that, sometimes code gets funky, especially with some of the people on the audience here. I know they like to write their own formulas, so leaving some documentation behind is never a bad thing. So here we go. So the SQ got stripped off of Bayview. We'll also notice at Cactus Club here, we can also see Earl's Kitchen. The DoorDashes are gone from those. So every time I refresh at this point in time, those things will be stripped off it. That's a general pattern replacement that I want to play over and over again. But Nick, you didn't have to say you were guilty. I knew. So here's the deal. What's the next one? What if I need to change certain things? Like this guy here, apple.com bill. When it's $13.11, I know exactly what that is. Okay, that is the Apple Care for my iPhone. The thing is that there's other reasons that I see apple.com/bill that show up. So this one's specific to this particular amount. So that's another thing that I might want to consider actually changing. What about something like PayBright? Well, PayBright I also know is financing for a phone as well. But you'll notice that the PayBright finance for iPhone, that one here, I could do it on a number by number basis. But at the same time, I mean, this is a global description that I might want to change for different things. So what I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to do some table replacements on these as well. So I'm just going to collapse my PAP stuff down here. And I'm going to open up this other range that I have. So I have a couple of targeted components that I want to take care of. So in this case, apple.com. When it's $13.11, I want to replace it with Apple Care for Ken's iPhone. When it's apple.com, I just want to call it Apple. Okay. I think it's really important to use the same billing descriptions in both places here. Otherwise, you end up in a cascading system that can become a little bit problematic. Everywhere where I see PayBright, I just want to replace it with PayBright for iPhone financing because that's what it is. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go and set up a couple of tables here. So once again, I'm going to go select my range, Control T. This one here is going to be my replace underscore targeted range. And this one here, again, Control T. And this one is going to be my replace underscore global. Okay. I can't even begin to tell you right now how good it feels to use that feature to just rename my table right off the bat and create the connection only query. Man, that makes life so much easier. Although I should probably also let you know that if you install Monkey Tools and you don't want that feature, you actually can turn it off through the Options Monkey. You can use the default from table or range experience, default Control T experience, and you can also uncheck or check this box here, and that will stop it from giving the connection only as well. So you have the ability to customize it. But man, I'm loving this. It makes me very happy. Anyhow, let me jump into these particular queries so that I can use them now. we're going to go and hop into this guy here. And the first thing that I need to do is, once again, I need to remove duplicates on the vendor and amount combination here. So we're going to do that. And for my replace global, I'm going to remove duplicates on just the vendor. Once again, we're not going to allow coding to multiple places here. I'm going to move these guys both into my raw data connections, and I'm going to go back to staging transactions. And now I'm going to go in and start playing around to replace my vendor name. So the first thing I'm going to do is rename this guy here. Oh, actually, hang on a second. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go and add a new step here, right-click, rename. We're going to go again with our little Windows dot, put in a couple of those, close that, come back here, and this is going to be my replace vendor names, so I can remember what the heck I'm actually doing here. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this column. So this is going to be vendor.original. There we are. And now I'm going to actually start merging in that data that I was looking for with my replacements for targeted and global. So we're going to merge in. We're going to go and grab our replace targeted. This one is going to be based on a combination of the original vendor and the amount, going to the vendor and the amount here. You'll notice it's picked up 1 of 18 rows that have matched that it found. So we'll say OK to that. And then I'm going to quickly rename this guy here. And this one is going to be merged vendors underscore targeted. Go. I'm now going to expand. I don't need the vendor because I already have it over here. I don't need the amount because I've already got it over here. It's only going to match these things here, but I do need the new name. We don't need the original column name. And there we go. That's the new name. So I've got this one, but I want to replace it with this guy here. So that does the targeted names. Now I also need to go and merge queries and grab the replace global. These ones are going to be strictly based on the vendor name. And in this case, you'll notice we got 6 of 18 rows matching. So we're going to go and say OK at this point. I'm going to rename this one here. So this one is going to be merged our vendors underscore global. We'll expand this just to get the new name again. And boom, there we go. We now know that this one would be replaced with Apple if it weren't for the fact that this actually tagged with a positive on the 1311. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make myself a new vendor column. Add column, conditional column. I'm going to call it vendor, which is the original name that shows up in the table that we load out of here. And the column name is going to say if new name does not equal null, then we're going to go with the new name. Okay, so basically, if this is not null, use it. Otherwise, if new name 1 does not equal null, then use new name 1. So if this one equals or doesn't equal null, use it. If these are null, we're going to check over here. If these don't equal null, we're going to use those. Otherwise, we're going to fall back to the original vendor. So here we go. Select the column, vendor original. And at this point, we should get values for everything here, but we can see these are picking up PayBright. This one is picking up Apple Care for Ken's iPhone. We still see SQW Bayview in our DoorDashes. That's because those replacements happen in the transactions queries will come after this one. Okay, so there we go. So I've added a conditional column here, which is added vendor. Now we can get rid of these 3 columns. There we go. And the rest is going to flow through here with our new names. So at this point in time, I can now go home, close and load. I can even close this if I want to, but I'm just going to go back over here. I'm going to run, refresh to get my latest statement. Notice that PayBright are all iPhone financing. We've got a Microsoft subscription that's doing the right thing there. Here's Apple Care for Ken's iPhone. Okay. Now, obviously, I can code the rest of this. I can update the report in this case, but what I want to show you here is what happens when we move to the next month. I copy in April's transactions, get latest statement. It goes and gets me April. Did a lot of spending in April, and there are a few observations that I want to draw out for you that you don't know because I've already taken care of them. Number 1, the DoorDash preferences, they're all gone. Earl's is a DoorDash receipt. If I look down, there's another Earl, Dynasty Dumpling, Joey, Dynasty, all of the Mumbai. These are all DoorDash receipts. So they've already had that stripped off of them. Coyote Coffee here is a square receipt, SQ space star. That's already been stripped off through the pattern replacements. From our global replacements, row 22, Apple. This used to have a different description. That one came through to actually show up properly. It was one of those apple.com descriptions. Rows 25 through 29 are all showing PayBright. We see that we've got those replacements going in. Plus, they've been coded, by the way, which is pretty awesome as well. And if we look down at row 34, I think there's the Apple Care for Ken's iPhone for the $13.11. If we look at some of the things that have been coded without tax, we've got a Microsoft subscription here that does not match the Microsoft subscription that I knew about, which is down here. So this one's coded to software, but doesn't have the tax in, where this one's coded software, but does. We coded Rogers, we haven't put the tax in, all the other things have been done. Okay, so the nice part about this is that we now have a system that every time we drop our new thing in here, we can hit refresh. And I did say there was one more thing that I wanted about this, was the fact that I could teach it so I could learn these different components. If I now look at something and say, hey, you know what? Maybe I don't want this to say Rogers ON all the time. I could now come back to this and say, well, let's go to the account table and do a replacement on this one here and call this one Rogers Mobility. Boom, there we go. We've added it to our global replace table. When we now come back and hit refresh, we can see that it actually picks up with Rogers Mobility. So as I'm coding through these things, if I realize that, hey, you know what, there's something that I can code it to an account name or whatever, all I need to do is come back over here and say, let me add it to the appropriate table in this place. And then going forward, I'm going to be able to teach my system over time exactly how to go and build this to try and reduce the total number of lines that I actually have to code. At that point, it becomes more of an exercise of checking things than it does becoming through doing all the data entry along the way. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that. Hopefully that's kind of a cool thing that you saw. I mean, it marries together a lot of Excel and Power Query techniques together, which I think is really kind of neat about this solution. It's not just a simple, drop it in Power Query, hit a refresh and call it a day. It's much prettier than that. I love the fact that on these things, we can actually make the pivot table look a little bit nicer. And check that out. There's all my iPhone financing and my Spotify's and all those kind of things there. I do want to just go through and finish off this little piece here as well, just with some resources, reference materials. Where do you learn how to do this kind of stuff and whatnot? So the first thing I'm going to call out here is that, as I said, I actually released a new update to Monkey Tools last Friday. This introduced the from table arrange monkey that you actually saw there. I didn't actually show you, I probably should, that the same from table or range monkey, we can actually use this if we've got just here, let me just grab a small set of tabular data here, paste this. If I go right click and get data from table or range, we actually interrupt that dialog as well. We create the proper table first, allow you to name it, and then we go and we create the Power Query after that. But if you're just using a Control-T experience, you can actually do that and create a connection-only query. The big difference is that when you do the get data from table or range, my data does not have headers. Okay, I'm just going to leave this as table 1 right now. And I say, okay, there's a couple things that are going to happen here. Number 1, because it didn't have headers, it puts the headers on there. But number 2, it launches you into Power Query so you can build the rest of the query, which is pretty cool. And that's, I mean, honestly, it's normal behavior for what you would expect, okay? The other thing that's really kind of neat about this too is that if I were, again, to go and grab some, well, actually here, let me do this one. I'm gonna go and say, let's do this, equals, and we'll go and grab this entire table here. I want account codes. I want open parenthesis, hash, oh, come on, it's not, code square, there we go. I want the whole table, so we're going to treat a dynamic array in this particular case. If you hit Control-T on this, we also pick up dynamic arrays, and with your get data, you can pick up dynamic arrays as well. Okay, so again, this is a free feature inside Monkey Tools. It's enabled for absolutely everyone that downloads it. It replaces Control-T on the from table experience. It allows you to define tables, named ranges, dynamic arrays to pull into Power Query, provides you the ability to create a connection-only query immediately during creation, and allows your naming before creating a query. And this is the big thing that's important about this, because the way that Excel does it by default is it will create your table with a terrible name, create a Power Query, and then when you go back and you rename your table, you blow up your Power Query. So we're trying to stop that process before it happens. And again, fully functional in the free license. If you're interested in picking up Monkey Tools, you can find it the entire website at monkeytools.ca. That's where you can download a trial, see how it works and whatnot. And you can learn specifically about the From Table Arrange Monkey at this link. Our knowledge base article has a video of how to work or how it works and all that kind of stuff. If you're interested in learning how to do this stuff, I teach these techniques in most of the courses that I do. Self-Service BI Bootcamp, virtually everything that we did through this whole thing is taught there in different pieces. The Power Query Academy covers these pieces. The Excel Fundamentals covers most of it, not the VBA aspects. Actually, SSBI doesn't either. But if you get into an Ask Me Anything session, I mean, this is where we teach you how to pull these things together based on user input. The vast majority of these techniques used today are taught in all three of the above courses. So if you're looking for places to learn how to do it, you should definitely check these out. If you're looking for Power Query recipes, we've got a recipe card collection. We've got my Master Your Data book. You can find those at skwt.com/books. And I will upload a link to this presentation into the meetup group as well. Mark, thank you for the comment on taking my courses. You know, I appreciate that. I work really hard on them. And I mean, the feedback that I generally get from people here is that they really enjoy them and learn a lot. So it's always great to get the validation from you guys in the chat there. I very much appreciate it. Finally, I'm going to end off with this slide here. You can find me at, you know, a few places, but you know, you can also find me on Meetup and in different areas as well. Listen, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. Thank you for the questions that came in. I hope that you found this interesting and inspiring, and hopefully we'll even see you at one of these courses where I can teach you some more stuff and we can get inspired with more questions. So there we go. Yeah. Thanks very much, folks. I'm going to sign off for tonight, and I will get the recording up in the next 24 to 48 hours so that you can watch it back at a little bit slower pace to maybe digest it a little bit more. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next time.